Jesus never rejects us for having questions. And he never rejects us for having doubts. So that's just not the way he operates. And so it's okay to have questions, and it's okay to have doubts. But we need to understand a few things about that as we kind of wrestle through some of those things. Because the default answer in Western Christianity to questions has often been, well, we'll just get more information. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but and that's sometimes a needed thing. But here's maybe the problem with that. If you follow Jesus closely, here's reality. You will never have all your questions answered. And there's a reason for that. It's because God is infinite in nature, which means he's inexhaustible, which means that every question you just get answered actually leads to more questions. And in fact, we'll spend eternity with God never being able to exhaust the depths of who God is. So he's infinite. And so if you come in here with questions and you're like, well, I just need this question answered, I want you to say that that's not necessarily a bad thing, but the simple reality is this, like, you're never going to have all your questions answered. And so the accumulation of knowledge about God, the accumulation of knowledge about Jesus, while not a bad thing, like, that's not going to be the answer for you. And more than that, the reality is this: a greater knowledge about God, a greater understanding about God, doesn't necessarily translate to a deeper, better faith. In fact, I'll show you guys this. Luke chapter 6, verse 47 through 49. This is Luke's account of the end of Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. And Jesus said this: "Why do you call me Lord, Lord, and do not do what I say? As for everyone who comes to me and hears my words and puts them into practice, I will show you what they are like. They're like a man who building a house, who dug down deep and laid the foundation on rock. When a flood came, the torrent struck that house, but could not shake it because it was built well. But the one who hears my words," watch this, "and does not put them into practice is like a man who built a house on the ground without a foundation. The moment the torrent struck the house, it collapsed and its destruction was complete." See, here's reality in Western American Christianity. A lot of times, our problem is not an information problem. Our problem often is not a knowledge problem. Our problem is an application problem. And so if all you ever try to think is, okay, if I've got these questions, I just need answers to the questions, what we need to understand is this. You can jot this down. Knowing what I need to know without doing what I need to do will never lead to faith that makes it through. I can know as much theology as possible. I can understand a systematic theology or lots of different systematic theologies. I can understand questions. I can understand apologetics. And there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing bad about that. But that is not going to ultimately lead to faith that is stable and faith that is sustainable, because knowledge without application just sets you up for a wreck, because what ends up happening is we end up basing our faith on answers. We end up basing our faith on a system, but when there's no application that follows that, it sets you up for a fall like Jesus just described here. And in fact, there are guys that I can think of. One guy, the name you may be familiar with, his name was Joshua Harris. He actually wrote a book about theology called Dug Down Deep. It was a great book. And then a few years later, he deconstructs and walks away from the faith. Why? It wasn't because he lacked answers. It wasn't because he lacked a system. It wasn't because he lacked knowledge. It was because there was a disconnect in what he knew and what he did. And this is actually the type of thing that actually fuels a deconstruction or like a serious criticism of the faith in other people, because they may say, well, you say all this stuff, you kind of put this information out there, but then you actually do something very, very different. And what happens in the lives of people like that, and maybe that describes you here, maybe that describes you online, is it actually leads to an improper rejection of the right theology because the practice of somebody is actually inaccurate. And so what we need to understand this morning is, man, yes, seek answers. There's nothing wrong with seeking answers. Like, God gave you this little grayish thing that floats between your ears, and he expects you to use it. But if it's not accompanied by action, if it's not accompanied by application, then it doesn't lead to a sustainable, growing faith. And so if you come in with the background of, well, Christianity means I just need to gain more knowledge, no more theology, like there's nothing necessarily wrong with that inherently, but that's not going to lead to the type of faith that makes it through. On the other hand, just application only or trying to do the right things is not going to be the answer either. And that's actually kind of where the default other end of the spectrum is from people who are very, very critical of, well, you say all these things, but there's nothing that backs it up with application and that sort of thing. So maybe it's not about knowledge at all. Maybe it's just about loving people. Maybe you've heard that kind of argument. Maybe that's your argument. Maybe that's your thought process. But that actually falls short too. In fact, Jesus said this in Matthew 7:21. This is actually in the middle of the Sermon on the Mount. And he says this: "Not everyone who says to me, 'Lord, Lord,' will enter the kingdom of heaven, but only the one who does the will of my Father." So that makes it sound like, okay, we've got to do the right things. But then he says this: "Many will say to me on that day, 'Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name, and in your name drive out demons, and in your name perform many miracles?'" Now, just as a pastor, like that kind of ministry, like that sounds awesome. Like you drive out demons, you perform miracles, like the Lord works through you in that. It's like, man, these guys, they sound like they're doing the right thing. And yet Jesus goes on to say in verse 23, "Then I will tell them plainly, I never knew you. Away from me, you evildoers." So knowledge isn't the answer ultimately, but neither is action. In fact, you can jot this down: doing what I'm supposed to do without, watch this, knowing who I need to know will never cause real faith to grow. So there's the extremes on the spectrum here. On the one end, it's, well, I just need to know information. I need to know knowledge. I need to know theology. I need to understand things about Jesus. But that doesn't actually lead to sustainable faith. And then on the other extreme is, well, I just need to do the right things. I need to love people. I need to serve people. Maybe it becomes, well, I need to do the religious checklist. I need to read my Bible and pray and go to church. And listen, there's nothing wrong with doing those things. There's nothing wrong with study. There's nothing wrong with application. We should do those things. But that's not the foundation of Christianity. In fact, the big idea for this morning, if you want to write this down, if you don't walk away with anything other than this, like walk away with this: Christianity isn't a subject to be studied, nor a religion to practice. It's a person to know. Christianity is not a textbook. Christianity is not an academic topic that I approach with, well, let me kind of look through this and let me kind of understand some things. And again, there's nothing inherently wrong with that, but that's not the answer. And Christianity is also not, well, let me just do a whole bunch of good things. Again, it's not a bad thing, but that's not the answer. The answer is no, it's not a subject. It's not a religion. It is a person to know, specifically the person of Jesus Christ. That's what defines Christianity.